Scott Pilgrim takes off. The show I liked, but didn't want.
Shazam wings me strawberry. Shazam wings me strawberry.
Go away.
So I just finished watching the new Scott Pilgrim show, and if you haven't watched it, I would suggest that you do because spoiler alert, and this is gonna be your only warning. Let me start off with a question that you may have asked yourself if you were interested in watching the show or if you had already watched the show. Do I need to watch the movie and or read the comics before I watch this show? Yes, the answer is yes. I would say you can watch the movie and be fine, but if you want to get the finer details, the comics are really the best place to start, or the only place to start, whatever. This show is what I would consider a what if scenario, or like an alternate timeline or something, because essentially this show happens because the movie happens. But before we can dive into that, we have to talk about what the show actually is. And it's kind of what most people feared, and which is why the title is what it is. This show is not about Scott Pilgrim, or at the very least, it doesn't follow him as the main character. That's right, it's a good old fashioned bait and switcheroo, as if we weren't all sick and tired of being led into a project with the carrot of a character that we all know and love, and being shafted with a lie, and forced to watch a story about someone no one really gives a hoot about. At least in this case, we do give a rat's patoot about the character of Ramona, and the show kind of delves into something that the movie didn't really give too much time to explore, that being accountability. And I believe the theme is accountability because even though the show happens because of the movie happens because of Ramona. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is about the titular character, Scott Pilgrim, meeting a girl, falling in love, and being forced to fight a gaggle of her superhuman ex-boyfriends. And the girl, which, it's cool, she's allowed to find herself, and that results in Scott learning to become a better person because, dating a 17-year-old at 23 was just not it. He even had to face an evil version of himself. Well, let's just put that aside for now. And over the course of the movie, he learned the lesson of not treating people like convenient tools for his own selfish gain. And Ramona, well, she started out as Ramona, a manic pixie dream girl with the inexplicable ability to travel through subspace, and being a wielder of what can only be described as a bag of holding. She just kind of remains the same, doesn't she? She isn't really given much of a character outside of, oh, hey, if you want to be with me, you have to fight these 7 dudes because I create problems that I'm seemingly unable to handle myself. And I'm not bagging her for that. I mean, we're all guilty of it. I'm just saying that there wasn't really a clear character goal for Ramona outside of her being an expo dump when a new baddie appeared, and then being relegated to a damsel in distress towards the end of the movie. And I know she was being mind controlled, but my point still stands. Now, why did I yap all that? It's because in the show, instead of Scott solving her problems with punching, she solves them herself with considerably less punching. So, before I get into what didn't work for me about the show, let me start with what did work for me. The animation, downright beautiful. I really love the art style for this show. I don't exactly know how to describe it, but it has a style that I've branded as punchy, like a mix of blocky and smooth line. Like there's lots of straight lines like in the hands, but there's also the close folds and the hands. It's simple in nature, but it's hard to recreate, at least for me, because I suck. And it really brings a feeling up to the movie that is what I would consider comic booky, or the whole style just fits for the universe at large and what kind of a story is being told, for the viewing audience. Take it or leave it, I enjoyed the dubbed voice acting. I thought bringing back the original cast to voice the animated series really makes it more palatable, especially if Michael Cera is and always will be the definitive Scott Pilgrim in your headcanon. I mean, I know he is for me. The music. I don't know what genre Sex Babam is, but I've always enjoyed their sound. And finally, I also enjoyed the story. Like, I like that this version, this universe, this what if scenario gave us a look at who all of these people were before Scott and who they would become if he wasn't in the picture. Or at least if he lost in the first fight. I think the show creates a believable story of what if the events of Scott Pilgrim just didn't happen. And on top of that, it turned out pretty good in my opinion. Now to get to the things that I didn't like. And first and foremost, the story. Oh wait, didn't you just go on about how we got a good story out of this what if bootstrap grandfather paradox? Yes, while the story was enjoyable for what it is, in my eyes, when put in the context of sort of a spiritual sequel for the movie, this isn't it, Chief. Like, I'm not comparing the two because they exist in two completely separate forms of media, literally. But if you told me this was what happened after the events of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, I think I'd be forced to laugh in your face. Not because, again, I don't think it's bad, but it doesn't really track well with how I personally believe a sequel story would go. We're falling into opinion territory. I mean, this entire video is opinion territory, but I'm letting you know specifically this is opinion territory. I would say it is debatable to say that this was a story we needed because it did show some depth for some characters that didn't really get that much love in the original movie. This isn't the story I wanted. And the reason for it is, well, I stated it earlier in the video. This series is a bait and switch. And there's nothing I despise more than being tricked into ingesting a piece of media, expecting one thing, and getting something completely different. And it was made very clear by episode 1. And by episode 2, I could not bring myself to care about watching anything that was going on in the story. And it was only through morbid curiosity that I continued to watch and was greeted with a surprisingly pleasant story that, while nice, again, I just kind of didn't want it. Now, I'm not getting on anybody that did want it and that did enjoy it, but if this story were advertised for what it really was, I don't think I would have put in any time to watch it. I want to assume that if you're watching this video, you already watched the show, but for those who didn't, I'm just gonna speed run the plot for the uninitiated because I already feel like this video is gonna be a lot longer than what I initially intended. Here we go. Scott Pilgrim, 23-year-old loser, is living with his cool gay roommate Wallace Wells, 25-year-old loser, in Toronto, Canada. Scott is fresh off a breakup and decided for whatever reason that he would start dating a high schooler. Not a great start for the character, but don't worry, the lines get even more blurred from here. The reason why I put emphasis on dating is because it's revealed later that Scott and the high schooler never did anything and have only held hands once. Just to really beat home the fact that he did not touch her, all right? He is not touching her. Erase my name from the list. He is not. Scott has a dream about a radical girl on skates that he immediately is enamored with, and by a stroke of luck, or maybe destiny, he goes to a house party with his bandmates. Oh yeah, did I mention he's in a band? What's the name again? And he sees the girl of or who was in his dreams. After an awkward first encounter, through a bit of scheming, Scott is able to see her again and manages to go out on a date with her. The date goes well, and Scott spends the night at her place and in the morning proposes that they continue to see each other, to which Ramona is receptive of the idea. A new bond is formed, and Scott, being the lovable dirtbag that he is, seems to have forgotten his prior engagement with the high schooler that he's totally doing nothing with. Ramona has to go to work, so she's kicking Scott out of the house, but before he leaves, he invites her to a gig that his band is playing. She agrees, and they go about their separate ways. Later in the day, Scott receives an ominous letter, something about a league of evil exes, just blah blah blah. He can't stop thinking about Ramona. Some more time passes, and it's time for the gig. Ramona meets with Scott, but so does Scott's actual not girlfriend, who will now be given a name, which is Knives. And you think shenanigans would ensue, but Scott manages to sidestep all that and they begin to play. But hark! In the middle of their set, some Indian kid shows up and challenges Scott to a fight. It's Ramona's evil ex, and Scott has no idea who this guy is, but nonetheless accepts his challenge to a fight and loses? This is where the show radically diverges from the movie, which I was actually kind of glad for, because even though I liked the movie, well, hold on, did I say like? I meant the movie fucks. I did not want this to be an animated retelling. Honestly, it wouldn't do the movie justice. Everything still holds up to this day. But in the same moment that I was glad for this not being an animated retelling, my hopes for this show dashed right then and there. Because after watching Scott be killed by literally one of the weakest characters in the League of Evil Exes, I knew immediately who this story was going to be about. And it wasn't the Indian kid. Why does the titular character of a beloved franchise being killed in the first episode only to have the story be about the secondary female protagonist ring any bells? Oh, whatever. You may have deliberately not called it He-Man, but you knew what we all came for. And that's the point. We all knew who we came to see, because the reality is that while even though Ramona Flowers is a cool character, not bagging her, allow me to state that again, The reality is that she does not have as big a draw as, well, Scott Pilgrim. If this show was called Ramona Flowers Takes Off, I don't think it would have as much buzz as it did with the title it currently has. I'm not trying to spread negativity, it's just kind of the truth. That's how marketing works. Okay, I'm going to continue to speed more through the plot because this is already longer than I wanted, and I've only done the first episode. Evil X number 1, Matthew Patel defeats Scott and learns that defeating him doesn't actually mean that Ramona is going to get back with him. Disillusioned, he summons all of the Evil X's and proceeds to pull a coup for the leadership of the League. The main baddie, Gideon, Ramona's most evil ex. No, literally, in the comics, he is a humongo D-bag. Since Gideon is the current leader, he doesn't like that one bit, and in a show of arrogance, and a bit of baiting from the other exes, which is hilarious by the way, decides that he'll not only wager the leader of the exes, but the entirety of his multi-billion-dollar company in fisticuffs. Now, does that ring a bell? I thought the fight was pretty cool and very well choreographed. I was kind of pulled out of it for its believability, mainly because, like, this is the weakest X. Like, Scott kind of mopped him in the movie and would have mopped him if he wasn't killed. More on that later. So for him to just defeat Gideon, it's a nice underdog story, but power scaling wise, it just doesn't happen. He's cooked, he's rice and curry, butter chicken, nigga, he's Vindaloo, whatever. Matthew Patel defeats Gideon and becomes the head honcho of everything. The League, the businesses, everything. He gets all this power, Gideon is defeated, and then he just kind of fucks off, waiting for the next time Ramona gets a new boy toy, or they don't, because they realize that defeating the current boyfriend doesn't win them the heart of Ramona, which is why they wanted to fight Gideon in the first place. So why is the League still together? Whatever. It's not actually important to the story, so I will classify this as a nitpick. The next few episodes after that sort of follows Ramona coming to terms with the sins of her past and patching up the hard feelings with her exes. The reasons for her doing so is because she discovers
he's alive!
Oh wow, so not only is he not dead, but we won't learn what's going on with him until later, towards the end of the series. And honestly, there goes all my investment in the Ramona plot. And the reason I say that is because now that I know Scott is alive, all I can think about is what's going on with him. And it almost feels like I want to speed run each episode until his plot gets picked back up again. Again, the story was enjoyable, but I didn't start watching the show for any of these people. I started watching it for Scott. Learning that Scott is alive, Ramona takes it upon herself to find out what happened to him and who might be responsible. The investigation starts with Roxanne. They brawl for a bit, and this is when you learn that the series is going to be taking a route of introspection and really figuring out what was the dynamic between Ramona and her exes and why did they end up leaving each other and what ultimately soured their relationships in the end. Which, again, I enjoyed. They brawl for a bit, they jump through movies because they're fighting in a movie store, whatever. Ramona ends up admitting that when she left her, she was too afraid to face her and talk about why she was leaving her in the first place. And again, this is another instance of introspection and really getting an understanding for the thoughts and motivations for why things happen from these characters. They make up. Roxy and Kim actually make out. Hot, but unnecessary. She ultimately learns that Roxanne had nothing to do with Scott's disappearance, and she moves on to the next culprit. Now on to the second evil ex, Lucas Lee. And his character turnaround, I kind of enjoyed the most out of all the exes, because he didn't just come to terms with his breakup with Ramona, he actually changed fundamentally and noticeably as a person, and he became better throughout the show. The episode with Lucas also brings in the subplot of young Neil writing a movie and managing to get it bankrolled for production. The movie is essentially the events of the Scott Pilgrim movie that the show is based on, and Lucas managed to get the lead role as Scott. After reading the script, however, Lucas gets perspective on his life because he learns that he seemingly dies in a dumb way in the events of what would have occurred if Scott wasn't killed in the first fight. And it delivers him from a bad boy with a devil-may-care attitude to an actually sweet guy who's still an idiot, because most of Ramona's exes are idiots, but in a lovable way. She definitely has a type. Lucas also, for whatever reason, sacrifices his acting career somehow and essentially becomes a nobody. Ramona discovers that he also had nothing to do with Scott's disappearance. They make up and he fucks off. Now, on to the third X, the superpowered vegan. After Lucas was ejected from the lead role, Todd Ingram, the vegan, takes up the mantle. Shenanigans ensue. He gets turned the fuck out by Wallace, Scott's cool gay roommate. Ramona confronts him with her, findings about Scott, what happened to him, and she discovers that he also has nothing to do with it. So she fucks off. There's also another subplot about Wallace making Todd discover that he's gay, but ultimately it adds nothing to the story, and it was really just played for a gag. But it did give me a laugh, so it's a pass for me. Matthew, remember him? He shows up at the production studio because, well, he owns it now, and he shuts the movie down because it's slander in his eyes, because, he is the first one to go in the actual events of the movie. What he does later is sort of important to the plot. I'm just gonna brush through it because I'll just get to it later. And while all this is happening, it turns out that Gideon, the evilest of the X's, decided that he would return to his roots and seek out someone from his past life, his life before Ramona. That person is Julie, voiced by Aubrey Plaza. She allows him to move into her place and they start dating, and it's cute, I guess. It looks like this crushing defeat for Gideon helps him turn over a new leaf. There's even a sequence between him and Lucas where they just hang out and destroy Julie's place. A bunch of losers that are like down on their luck, and they're just being bros, hanging out and enjoying each other's companies, as bros. And at around this time, Julie was out of the house, and when she returned with Ramona in tow, because Gideon was her next lead, they pieced together a clue that she hadn't noticed before. It was a little robot that was created by the twins. It had been following them around throughout the entirety of the movie. So after learning that Gideon had nothing to do with Scott's disappearance, she moves on to the next logical culprits, which are the twins. Ramona heads back to her place. Outside, she discovers the sex bomb crew. Steven, Kim, young Neil, and apparently Knives. They all head inside and Ramona gives them the rundown on what happened to Scott, which is essentially the little robot that was following them around, managed to perfect time travel, and was the reason for Scott's disappearance. Because earlier in the series, Ramona learns that the reason why Scott is alive is because he was sucked through a time portal and trapped in the future, because the robot was vegan. Whatever. When on their way to confront the twins, it's discovered that young Neil didn't write the movie, but instead it was a strange figure from the future. Who could it be? More on that later. They begin to disembark to the twins, but right outside the door to Ramona's place is none other than Scott Pilgrim. And in my eyes, this is where the story actually picks up. It sucks that there's only 2 more episodes left in the season. Whatever. The reason why I say this is where the story picks up, because even though the show has been a character analysis for her evil, well, not so evil anymore exes, which is definitely a nice story with some genuinely heartwarming moments, it really wasn't enough to keep me going throughout the series. Legit, I only kept watching because I wanted to learn what happened to Scott, because every time the story became about the exes, it felt like it came to a screeching halt to tell a story that ultimately does not affect the overall plot. Now, I'm going to say I think that last statement I just made may be debatable, but I watched the entire show in one sitting and I began writing this immediately after, so it's fresh in my memory. And really the only thing about the exes was when Ramona spoke to them just to learn that she's got the wrong person, which is like whatever to me. I think you could have moved the plot along without delving into the exes' lives, but the show is about Ramona dealing with her exes. It makes sense from a storytelling standpoint, and I will once again just mark this as nitpicking. We jump back to earlier in the series when Scott was taken, and it's revealed that the mysterious figure that took him was him. This version of Scott, old Scott, looks a bit disheveled, however. It looks like the future has not been too kind to our lovable nitwit of a titular character. And when pressed on the future of him and Ramona's relationship, he has this to say.
Down for you. Fighting those exes was the biggest mistake of our entire life. Because we lost? No. Because we won.
Quite the shocking revelation. Scott, with the use of very convenient VR technology, love that scene by the way, discovers that he and Ramona lived happily ever after, getting married and going on many an adventure, only for it to be revealed that, well, they're divorced 13 years after they got married. Scott is, of course, a bit saddened by this and wishes to return to the past to make things work with Ramona, but old Scott is adamant about not getting together with her. Whatever she did to him, it must have been bad, but more on that later. I didn't know really where to put this, so I guess I'll just insert it here. But when Scott fights the exes and they turn to coins, they don't actually die. Old Scott explains that when they're defeated, they respawn, and I forget where, but it was also confirmed that in the movie when they were defeated, they would respawn at home. And the reason why they didn't go back after Scott was that some of them had learned their lesson, and also none of them lived in America. So getting back to Toronto would have been a hassle for them. And that's just like a nice little tidbit that I thought was really funny. So again, I don't know where I could have added it, throwing it in wherever. Okay, back to the story. Because Scott didn't want to listen to Old Scott would not send him back to the past. So they had to enlist the aid of old Ramona. Oh my goodness, she's bad. And with the use of rollerblades created from an old DeLorean, they managed to make it back to the past. And now we're back from where the episode last picked up from. You know, when Scott shows up at the door. All right, now I'm going to go back to nitpicking, but Old Scott never fully revealed why it was that he and Ramona were separated, just that he did everything right and Ramona broke his heart and rollerbladed all over it. So it creates a little mystery box because it's been established throughout the series that Ramona is kind of a flighty little temptress and Scott, well, he's Scott. So it would really be up in the air as to whose fault it actually was. But my thing is this, when Scott gets with old Ramona, why doesn't he ask what happened and how he can avoid it? Instead, we got a convoluted plot about how old Ramona knew that Scott would go back in time to change things, and instead of going to Scott to talk things out, she decides she would go back in time and write a script of the actual events of the Scott Pilgrim movie. Yeah, it turns out that young Neil didn't write the script, it was Ramona from the future, and that plan, well, ultimately backfires because, well, Matthew canned everything. But it's because of this backfiring plan is why the events of the show were even able to turn out the way that they did. And do you just get what I mean now? I actually think the messiness of this story makes for a better kind of storytelling narrative, what have you, because it matches what these characters would do believably, that instead of talking things out, they would go with these misguided, short-sighted plans that ultimately explode in their faces, and then they're forced to deal with their problems at the peak and handle their issues like adults. And upon figuring out that her plan ultimately didn't work, because Scott kind of just started poking holes in her plan, like of all people, he's poking holes in the plans, he convinces her to, help him out, get back to the past after he witnesses the new timeline that was created from his disappearance and what Ramona has been doing to try and get him back. And that paints to the old Ramona, maybe their love really is still worth fighting for. So they get back to the past. Ramona takes a couple of photos with her future self. Scott reconciles and breaks up with Knives. Oh yeah, Knives and Steven had like a story plot that leads into the final act, but it isn't really that important to talk about except in this sentence right now. But their side plot is what helps set the stage for the final act. Look, I am speeding through this. So we get to the final act. Scott and Ramona are finally reunited, circumventing the entire plot of the original story and just still getting their happy ending. They go into embrace and there's a force field keeping them from kissing, which is weird. But because of this, Ramona believes that her evil exes are still up to their old tricks, and Scott believes that he may still have to fight them. But at this point, where could any of them possibly be? It is then revealed through Knives and Steven that they were able to get a deal to write a Broadway musical based on the events of the Scott Pilgrim movie that would star Matthew Patel, because apparently he was a theater kid, and him being in charge of the League of Evil Exes, they would be inclined to attend this event. The team make it to the theater and one by one confronts the exes, and one by one discover that once again they've got the wrong guys, and girl, she's allowed to explore her options. Being at a complete loss, what is there else to do? Guess they'll watch the musical. Also, there's another subplot where Gideon, who's revealed his name is actually Gordon Goose, wants to blow up the entire theater in an attempt to get his empire back from Matthew because he needed something to do, I guess. But again, not really important. I just thought I would add that in there. During the musical, Sexbomb, Ramona, and all 7 of the exes are inexplicably teleported to the moon. And when faced with the culprit of this unwanted extrication, it's even older Scott. Ugh. And he's jacked. Oh. So why did he come back? Or I guess, why does he still exist as his bad ending self? So it turns out that still no lessons are learned, and in another short-sighted attempt, Scott decides that he would seal himself away for 10 odd years to become so powerful that he can just wave clear all of Ramona's exes as well as his past self for whatever reason. And if you don't mind me getting back to nitpicking territory, if he kills himself, then he would cease to exist, and then the events of the show would just happen again, leading to him having to seal himself away for 10 years to then kill himself to cease to exist again. Timey-wimey nonsense. Nitpicking. So, in a final clash with the two Scotts, regular Scott swears up and down that he won't become older Scott, but older Scott makes a really good point in saying, "I'm you!" And this kind of sends regular Scott for a loop, because the reason this older Scott exists is because that even though the events of the show happened, he and Ramona still separate and he becomes a hermit. So does that mean everything that's happening is all for nothing? Just when things are at their lowest, older Scott has the upper hand and Ramona begins to question whether all this suffering is even worth it. Out of nowhere, we get a Deus Ex Ramona in the form of an even older Ramona. She just stays bad. And the next line of dialogue kind of summarizes the entire failings of, well, not the story, because even though the whole thing is convoluted, for the most part, it's actually been easy to follow. And let me just cut away. That's another thing that I like about this show. I didn't want this show, but this is what I like about it. The story was actually pretty easy to follow. It wasn't preachy. It followed the rule of cool, which I really enjoyed. And the things that happened in the story happened because of another thing instead of this happened and then this happened. Fucking love that. Where was I? Oh, okay. The next lines of dialogue summarize why both Scott and Ramona are just big idiots that never learned anything.
10 years! Not even a text? Then Wallace tells me you're training to go back in time and fight yourself?
Well, not just myself. A lot of people. And a robot.
We hit one rough patch, and you go completely insane?
And it's just, yeah, he didn't contact you, but neither did you. I'm not saying that what he did is your fault because he made his own choice to become crazy, but you didn't think to check in on him every now and then, especially if you yourself said that you guys weren't actually separated and that you needed some space. Well, he gave it to you. Young Ramona realizes that her and Scott's futures are kind of set in stone if they continue down their paths. And she decides that she will no longer run from her problems, but she will embrace them. She merges with older Ramona, becomes a Super Saiyan, and fixes everything. Everyone is sent back to the theater and their respective timelines, and it's a happy ending for all, except older Scott, kind of. That's Scott Pilgrim takes off. I would ultimately give this 6.5 Scotts out of 10. Initially, it really ticked me off that they made Scott the ultimate big bad, because for a split second I was like, oh, of course they make the titular character, who's a male, the villain who ultimately gets defeated by a woman because girl power. But then I decided to look at the story for what it actually was, a tale of Scott being a short-sighted idiot. And after I viewed it from that lens, everything just came together, in my mind at least. And that's exactly what would happen if Ramona and Scott broke up. And Scott ends up becoming the most evil ex of them all, a dark future, if you will. Ramona in the series is set up as someone who's always running from her problems, and Scott is literally obsessed with her, and also an idiot. So of course he would use time travel to try and change things without considering the repercussions of such an action. Even older Ramona came back and was like, I just asked you for some space and you abandoned me for 10 years. And Scott's like, well, technically I was giving you space. That just shows that after all these years, they never really learned their lessons. And when it comes to taking other people's feelings into consideration, taking accountability for their actions, they just end up blaming each other for the way that things turned out. After realizing that she was the cause of all their problems, current day Ramona decides to merge with her future self and becomes a demigod and decides that she won't change the future and allows things to play out as they may, because while things can get messed up, they don't have to stay messed up. Everything gets fixed, and in this new timeline, Ramona made amends with her exes and Scott still gets to grow. So it's a win for everyone involved. Also, Gideon gets his company back, Lucas gets a job, Matthew is also happy, and well, who just cares about anyone else? Here's another question though, that I was asking myself as I watched the show play out. Does this show essentially erase the events of the movie? I mean, yes and no, because without the events of the movie, the show wouldn't have happened. And it was the events of the movie that was used as a kind of plot device that allowed the story to pan out the way that it did, that wouldn't have happened if the movie didn't happen. But does that also mean that because the movie happened, the events of the show didn't happen? Because we still have the movie, which is the actual current timeline, right? To that I say this: because I thought the show was good, but I ultimately didn't want it, I'll mark these events as a what if Scott became an evil X timeline. That the events of the movie created a branch timeline that led to the events of the show, and that they exist separate from one another even though it's kind of a sequel. But if I can pretend that the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull didn't happen, I can pretend that this show exists in a canon, non-canonical state of existence. Superpositioned, whatever. It's a Scott Dinger's box. Scrooge Pilgrim. Okay. Overall, I think this show did what it set out to do. Tell a story about Ramona Flowers. And I enjoyed it for what it was. But by the end of it, I really didn't care for its existence. And honestly, I'm not going to give my opinion on whether or not the show justifies its own existence, because who cares? If you liked it, you liked it. If you didn't, you didn't. Move on. Did I get all my nitpicks out? Oh yeah, okay. The sub is garbo to me. Whatever. This show was intended to be in English anyway. Shut up. Same thing with Edge Runners. Shut up. You don't get the same experience with the slang of cyberpunk in Japanese. I remember watching a side-by-side of the dubbed and the subbed, and they were both just kind of painful to watch to me. Like, honestly, I couldn't get over it. I will say this, some of the English VAs, it was clear that they didn't really have much training doing voice work. And it's weird because it's almost like the emotion expressed in their voices didn't really match up well with the faces. Again, a nitpick, but Michael Cera as Scott and Will Forte as older Scott were just excellent. Knives also good and nice and expressive. Gideon was good, Lucas was good, everyone else was passable. It didn't really take away from the story. The art style is what really kept me coming back. Okay, is that it? Yeah, okay. Like and subscribe or I'm gonna get ya.